I remember the moment. The noise of the city finally broke me. Sirens every hour, voices bleeding through paper-thin walls, the hum of traffic that never stopped. It all pressed down like a constant weight. I had been working 12-hour days, living off takeout and caffeine, pretending the exhaustion was normal. Then one morning I woke up to silence in my apartment. My phone had died overnight. The city still roared beyond the glass, but for a few minutes it was muted. That stillness felt like something sacred. That was the moment I decided to leave. I found the cabin online. No photos beyond a grainy exterior shot and a short description. Rustic, secluded, near lake access. The price was cheap enough to make me suspicious, but I didn't care. I told myself I needed peace, even if I had to find it in the middle of nowhere. The drive took 6 hours. The further I went, the less the world looked like the one I knew. Suburbs gave way to farmland, then farmland to long stretches of pine that swallowed the road. The last sign of cell service vanished 30 minutes before I reached the address. I remember glancing at my phone, watching the signal bars fade to nothing and feeling an unexpected relief. No messages, no work, no noise. The road turned to gravel before the final mile. My tires crunched over pale stones, each sound sharp against the quiet. Pine trees leaned inward like walls closing around me. The late afternoon light turned thin and gold, filtering through the needles in narrow beams. For the first time in months, I breathed without tension in my chest. Then I saw the cabin. It stood at the edge of a clearing 1 story tall, built from gray wood darkened by weather. A small porch wrapped around the front, overlooking the lake that shimmered through the trees. It looked peaceful in a way that almost felt staged, like a painting hung crooked. The silence there was different from the city's. It wasn't the absence of sound, but something else, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and old dust. A single room held the kitchen and living space, with a small bedroom at the back. The furniture was simple: wooden table, worn armchair, a bed covered with a heavy wool blanket. The floor creaked in a slow rhythm when I walked, like the cabin was adjusting to me. I unpacked my bag, made coffee on the gas stove, and watched the light fade outside. The lake reflected the darkening sky like glass. No traffic sounds, no hum of electricity, only the steady chirp of crickets. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely alone. Night came fast. I sat on the porch with my mug, listening to the forest shift as temperatures dropped. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Then silence again. The crickets stopped all at once. The air thickened, cool and still. It was the kind of quiet that pressed into your ears until you could hear your own pulse. I told myself I was imagining things. New environment, strange acoustics. Still, I found myself glancing toward the tree line more than once. The shadows there seemed to breathe. Every time I blinked, the shapes changed slightly. Inside, I lit a lantern and checked the locks out of habit. There was a single deadbolt on the front door, a small chain that looked more decorative than useful. I told myself it was safe enough. By midnight, the air had cooled to the point where I could see my breath. I left the lantern burning low on the counter and lay in bed. The silence grew thicker. I thought I heard the soft creak of wood shifting outside, but dismissed it as the porch cooling under night air. Then I heard it. A knock. Soft, almost polite. 3 quick taps against the front door. I froze. The sound didn't echo like wood on wood, it was closer, heavier. I sat up, heart thudding. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a branch, but the knocks came again. 3, exactly the same rhythm. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and crept through the narrow hallway. The floorboards groaned under each step. I aimed the beam at the door but saw nothing through the window, just darkness, dense and unmoving. Another knock. This time it sounded lower, more deliberate. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. The sensible part of me whispered not to open it, but curiosity has a way of winning when you're alone. I unlatched the chain and cracked the door an inch. Cold air swept in. The porch was empty. But something waited at my feet. A pile of pine cones, carefully stacked in a small pyramid. I stared at it for a long time, flashlight trembling in my hand. They weren't scattered like debris. They were arranged, perfectly balanced. The edges glistened faintly with sap under the beam. The smell of wet pine filled the air. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing moved. The trees stood still, black against the sky. No wind, no sound. I picked up one pinecone. It was heavier than it should have been, sticky and cold to the touch. I dropped it quickly and went back inside, locking the door tight. The rest of the night, I lay awake listening to the forest breathe. Every creak of wood felt like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper pressed against the walls. By morning, the pinecones were gone. Only a faint circular mark remained on the porch where they had been placed, as if the wood itself had absorbed their shape. I told myself it was nothing, a prank maybe, a coincidence. But the forest outside didn't look the same in daylight. It looked like it was waiting. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, thin and pale, carrying a kind of quiet that felt unnatural. I made coffee, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The forest outside looked still, painted rather than alive. No wind, no sound. Even the lake was flat, a sheet of glass catching faint ripples that seemed to come from beneath the surface, not above it. I stepped onto the porch, half expecting to find the pinecones returned, but there was nothing. Only that faint circular mark on the boards, darker than the rest, as if the wood had soaked in something overnight. I told myself it was water, dew, anything that made sense. I decided to walk the property. Maybe I needed to remind myself that this was just a patch of forest like any other. Nothing magical or sinister, just trees and silence. The air was crisp, colder than it had any right to be in late summer. The deeper I walked, the closer the trees grew together until they formed a kind of wall. The ground was soft, thick with fallen needles that muffled every step. My own breathing became the only sound. When I called out once just to break the silence, the echo came back wrong, delayed, slightly higher in pitch, like someone else mimicking me from farther in. The path, if it could be called that, ended quickly. Beyond it, the trees pressed so close that I could barely slip between them. Each trunk seemed to twist slightly, bending toward the cabin. I turned back before I lost sight of the clearing. When I returned, I found something I hadn't noticed before. The cabin's windows didn't reflect the forest the way glass should. Instead of showing the trees, they showed a gray wash, like the reflection of storm clouds even though the sky was clear. I rubbed one with my sleeve, thinking it was dirt, but it stayed that way, muted, opaque, like the glass itself refused to mirror what stood before it. Inside, the air felt heavier. The coffee had gone cold on the table, untouched. I sat for a while, listening for something, anything. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was expectant, the kind that waits. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. At one point, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, just a shape sliding past the tree line. I stood up fast enough to knock over the chair. Outside, everything was still again. Not a single branch swayed. I checked the time. It was only 4 in the afternoon, but the light was already fading. The trees seemed to drink it in, pulling dusk closer before its time. I cooked dinner with the radio on for noise, though the static drowned every channel. The forest pressed against the glass as the light dimmed. I locked the doors early that night, dragging a chair beneath the handle like I'd seen in old movies. By 10, darkness swallowed everything beyond the porch. Even the reflection of the lantern in the window looked strange, slightly off-center, delayed by a second. When I turned my head, it followed too quickly, as if eager to match me. The knock came just before midnight. 3 quick raps, the same rhythm as before. I froze, hands clamped around the edge of the chair. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. The sound came again, lower this time, as if someone taller was using the side of their fist instead of knuckles. I forced myself to move, the floorboards creaking under each step. Through the narrow window, I could see the porch light catching something small and pale. I wanted to ignore it, pretend it wasn't there. But curiosity is a slow sickness. It wears you down. When I opened the door, the air outside hit like ice. There at my feet lay a bird. A small one, maybe a sparrow. Its wings had been arranged carefully beside its body, feathers splayed perfectly. The eyes were closed and there was no blood, just stillness. It looked placed, offered. I stared for a long time, waiting for the forest to move or the wind to pick up, but nothing happened. The air was too still, the trees too quiet. My breath felt too loud. I picked the bird up with shaking hands, wrapped it in a paper towel and walked it to the edge of the clearing. I buried it shallow beneath the pine needles, whispering an apology I didn't understand. Back inside, I locked every door, every window. I pulled the blinds tight. The silence returned, heavier now, thick enough to hear the hum of blood in my ears. I sat in the chair all night with the lantern burning low, staring at the door and waiting for the next knock. It never came. But somewhere between exhaustion and sleep, I thought I heard the forest exhale. Not wind, something deeper, slower, like lungs drawing in air. When dawn came, I opened the door. The dirt where I had buried the bird was smooth again, untouched, as though it had never been there at all. The forest was silent when I woke, not quiet in the normal way, but stripped bare of sound. No birds, no wind, no movement. The kind of silence that presses against the windows like fog. I brewed coffee just to hear something. Even the faint rattle of the percolator felt comforting. I drank it standing by the door, staring at the tree line, trying to convince myself that yesterday's unease was nothing more than isolation playing tricks. The sun was bright, but the light looked wrong, thin. It fell between the pines like diluted gold, never reaching the forest floor. The trees seemed closer than before, their trunks leaning at angles that made no sense. I tried to shake it off, grabbed my jacket and went walking toward the lake. The water was still as glass. I stood there a while, staring at my reflection, then realized I couldn't hear the water move. Not even when I tossed a pebble into it. The ripples spread out, but they made no sound. The only noise came from my breathing. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, distant, almost part of the wind. At first I thought it was the sound of branches rubbing together, but it came again, clearer this time. It wasn't wind. It was a word, my name. I froze, staring into the trees. Nothing moved. No shapes, no shadows, just the dark lattice of pine trunks stretching forever. Then it came again, closer. The same tone, same soft drawl. My name carried through the still air as though spoken from a distance that wasn't physical. I called out, voice shaky, echoing between the trees. Hello. No answer. Only the sound of the whisper returning, quieter now, retreating like it was hiding behind something. The hair on my arms lifted. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the trees until I reached the cabin door. The moment I stepped inside, the whisper stopped. All afternoon I sat at the table, staring at the window. Nothing stirred. The forest stayed perfectly still, but the air inside the cabin carried a strange tension, a low hum that wasn't mechanical but alive. I turned off every light just to listen. It was faint, like the sound of wind through a hollow place, but it was there, steady, rhythmic. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin felt magnified. Around midnight the sound returned. Not outside this time, but closer. I lay in bed, holding my breath. A whisper again. My name. But now it came from the other side of the wall, low and deliberate. I sat up fast, heart hammering. The lantern light flickered as if reacting to something unseen. I told myself it had to be the pipes or maybe the wind through the cracks, but deep down I knew better. The sound was too precise. I crept into the living room, flashlight shaking in my hand. The cabin walls glowed faintly under the thin moonlight leaking through the curtains. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow pass behind the window, tall and quick, but when I pulled the curtain back, the forest stood frozen. My breath fogged the glass. Then came a soft tap. Not from the door, from the window beside my head. 3 slow taps, perfectly spaced. I jumped back, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun across the floor, landing on the far wall. I forced myself to look. Through the glass, faintly visible in the reflection, was my own face staring back. But it wasn't moving like I was. It blinked late, smiled when I didn't. The reflection tilted its head just slightly, as though studying me. I stumbled backward and hit the table. The lantern flickered once and went out. For a moment I was left in pure darkness. My breathing filled the room, fast and shallow. I fumbled for the matches and lit the lantern again. The light chased away the reflection, revealing only empty glass. No face, no shape, nothing but the dark forest beyond. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been exhaustion, the mind playing tricks after too many sleepless nights. I needed structure, routine. I decided to hike again, to find the boundary where the forest ended, where I could see a road or a fence or anything that connected to the world beyond this patch of wilderness. But no matter which direction I walked, the trees never broke. After an hour, I could still see the same curve of the lake behind me. After 2 hours, I was sure I'd been walking in circles. The forest didn't feel random. It felt built, like something had placed each tree deliberately to trap me inside a pattern. When I finally stumbled back into the clearing, my legs were shaking. The sun was already setting, though I could have sworn I'd left before noon. I went inside and locked the door behind me. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. That night I left the lantern burning brighter. I sat facing the window, waiting to see my reflection again. It didn't come. But every now and then I heard the faintest whisper threading through the trees. My name drawn out, patient, like the forest itself was learning how to say it right. By the 4th morning, I stopped pretending I was relaxed. The quiet no longer felt peaceful. It was something else, something aware. I woke up to a feeling that I wasn't alone before even opening my eyes. The air in the cabin carried a faint scent of damp pine and iron, like rain on metal, though the sky outside was clear. When I stepped onto the porch, something was waiting. At first I thought it was just debris, but as I looked closer I realized they were arranged. 5 small objects set carefully in a straight line across the step. A smooth gray stone, a bird feather, a strip of bark, a bent nail, and a coin so old the details were rubbed away. All positioned evenly apart, perfectly centered with the door. I stared at them for a long time, my coffee cooling in my hand. The arrangement was too deliberate to be random, but I didn't know what else to call it. I knelt down and brushed my fingers over the stone. It was cold. The kind of cold that doesn't come from the air. The feather trembled slightly as if stirred by breath, though there was no wind. Someone or something had left them there while I slept. I took a photo on my phone, mostly to prove to myself it was real. Then I swept the objects aside and threw them into the woods. They hit the ground without a sound. No rustle, no echo, just gone. I locked the door, shut every window, and told myself it was an animal. A raccoon. A curious kid from a nearby cabin. Any story that kept the truth small enough to live with. By afternoon, the forest began to hum again. It wasn't a noise I could trace, but a vibration that passed through the ground. I sat on the porch, trying to ignore it. The air shimmered faintly between the trees, as if heat was rising from the soil, but the temperature was cold enough that I could see my breath. I tried reading. I tried music. Nothing helped. The silence between the sounds grew thick, stretching seconds longer than they should. When the sun started to dip, I noticed something strange in the soil near the cabin's edge. Footprints. Bare. Long-toed. They started at the tree line and stopped halfway to the porch, as if whoever left them had simply vanished into the air. I stared at them until the light drained from the sky. That night I didn't turn off the lantern. Shadows crawled across the walls in slow, deliberate motions, as though something outside was moving between the trees. I could hear faint pops from the wood settling, but one sound didn't fit: the creak of the porch boards under weight. It came from directly outside the door. Tap. Pause. Creak. My pulse roared in my ears. I stepped closer, flashlight ready. The sound came again, 3 slow knocks against the door, each one deliberate. Waiting between them, I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just listened. Silence. Then a second set of knocks, lower this time, as if from near the bottom of the door. I shouted through the wood, voice cracking, "Who's out there?" Nothing answered, not even the echo of my own words. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the door, the night was empty. The air felt thicker, wet against my skin. My light swept across the porch. No footprints, no motion, just one thing waiting on the step. A new object. A thin piece of cloth, torn, faded and wet. It looked handmade, maybe linen or cotton. A dark stain spread across one corner. I told myself it was mud. It had to be mud. I picked it up with the flashlight shaking in my hand. The fabric was cold, colder than the air. My fingertips went numb where I touched it. I dropped it fast and stepped back inside, slamming the door and locking it again. The knocking didn't return, but something else did. A soft sound from the back of the cabin. 3 knocks. From the opposite wall. I stood frozen. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, not echoing, answering. I couldn't breathe. My flashlight beam shook against the wall, catching the framed mirror that hung above the kitchen counter. For a second, I saw movement inside it, something passing through the reflection that didn't exist in the room. The glass quivered faintly, as though touched from the other side. The sound stopped. Then silence again. I backed away until my legs hit the edge of the bed. I sat there for the rest of the night, gripping the flashlight until my hand cramped. When the first gray light of morning spilled through the window, I checked the back wall. The paint was intact. No damage. No sign of anything that could make that sound. The mirror hung still. But when I looked outside, new footprints circled the cabin, deep, clear. And near the porch, pressed into the soil beside the step, was the torn piece of cloth I had dropped, folded neatly, waiting to be taken again. The next day I couldn't sit still. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than before, pressing down like humidity that had no source. Every sound echoed wrong: the scrape of a chair, the drip from the faucet, my own footsteps. I needed to leave, if only for an hour. I needed to see the forest again in daylight, to remind myself that it was just trees and earth and wind, nothing more. I followed the line of footprints from the night before, tracing them until they vanished into the undergrowth. The forest swallowed sound as soon as I entered. No insects, no birds, only the rhythm of my breathing and the faint crunch of pine needles underfoot. The deeper I walked, the more the trees seemed to lean inward, trunks curving subtly as if bending toward the same invisible center. I told myself it was an illusion of perspective. Still, my chest tightened with every step. After what felt like 20 minutes, I reached a clearing I hadn't seen before. It was small and oddly circular, ringed with tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. At the center stood a massive tree, wider than the cabin itself, its bark blackened and split with age. A hollow gaped near its base, tall enough for a person to crouch inside. Something about it pulled at me. I knelt beside the hollow and peered in. The air that drifted out was cool and smelled faintly metallic. Deep inside, the faint glimmer of something caught the light. I reached in carefully, fingers brushing against objects arranged in a small pile: stones, twigs, bits of metal, a strip of cloth identical to the one left at my door. Every instinct told me to stop, but I couldn't. I touched one of the objects and something cold moved against my wrist. Not a breeze, something solid. It was gone before I could pull back, but the chill it left sank deep into my skin. My heart hammered. I stumbled backward, falling into the soft needles. The forest around me shifted slightly, as though every tree had inhaled at once. When I turned to run, a sound rose from the hollow, low, drawn out and wet, like the first creak of a door long sealed shut. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the trees, half blind, tearing through branches until the cabin came into view again. I didn't realize I was crying until I reached the porch. My hands shook as I grabbed the handle. That's when I saw the fingerprints. Across the door, 5 long smears of mud. Not random streaks, but deliberate. Each one pressed deep into the wood, angled downward like something had gripped the frame to pull itself closer. I stumbled inside and locked the door. My breath came in short bursts. The air felt electric, charged with something alive and unseen. I checked every corner of the cabin, every window, every lock. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat on the bed for hours, staring at the door. The light faded until only the lantern's orange glow painted the walls. I told myself I'd imagined it all, the hollow, the cold touch, the prints. I tried to sleep. But around midnight the air shifted. The temperature dropped so fast that the window glass fogged over in seconds. Then I heard it, a faint sound just outside, not footsteps, breathing, slow, patient, steady. It came from the direction of the porch. I pulled the blanket to my chest and held still, barely daring to inhale. The breathing grew louder for a moment, then faded again. A single creak followed, the porch boards bending under weight. I stared toward the window, every muscle locked. A shape passed across the fogged glass, tall and thin, too close to the surface to be anything but right outside. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The shape lingered for several seconds, then vanished. When dawn came, I gathered enough courage to open the door. The porch was empty, dew clinging to the wood. No footprints this time. No gifts. Only the faint echo of my own reflection in the window glass, pale and sleepless. I told myself it was over, that maybe the forest had finished whatever game it was playing. But when I looked toward the tree line, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The massive tree in the clearing, the hollow one, was visible now through the distant pines. I could see it clearly from the cabin's porch. The day before, it had been at least a mile into the woods. Now it stood less than 200 feet away. I didn't go back inside right away. I stood on the porch staring at that impossible tree in the distance. The hollow trunk looked darker than the others, almost charred, a shape like an empty mouth carved into its base. Even from far off, it felt like it was facing me. I stepped back into the cabin and shut the door slowly, keeping my hand on the handle as though something might try to push it open. The silence inside felt sharper than before. I could hear the ticking of my wristwatch. I could hear the faint drip in the kitchen sink. Every tiny sound seemed stretched thin, like the air was amplifying it. I grabbed my phone without thinking. I opened the camera roll to look at the pictures I had taken earlier in the week. Maybe I wanted proof that the tree hadn't always been so close. Maybe I wanted something normal to ground myself. The first photos were the ones from the porch, the pine cones, the strange objects lined up, the cloth. They looked flat and harmless in the gallery, like props from a story that didn't matter. But when I opened the third photo, my breath stopped. There was something in the background. Between the pines, barely visible through the shadows, a figure stood. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, its head angled slightly as though listening. It was faint, almost swallowed by the darkness, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I swiped to the next photo, taken only seconds later. The trees were empty. I stared at the screen, throat tight. My hands shook so hard the image blurred. I pressed delete. I wanted it gone. But when I scrolled back up the gallery a minute later, the photo had returned. Same angle, same figure, same unnatural posture. I deleted it again. It came back again. My chest tightened with a pressure that felt almost physical. I shut the phone off, tossed it on the table, and stepped away from it like it had burned me. The room seemed smaller now. The walls leaned inward, or maybe it was only my nerves twisting everything out of shape. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed faster than it should have. The shadows outside lengthened until they stretched across the clearing like dark fingers. I watched them move, slow and deliberate, as though guided by something unseen. That was when I saw it. At the far end of the clearing, behind the last row of pines, stood a figure. Tall, thin, completely still, facing the cabin, the same proportions as the one in the photograph. My throat dried, my hands went numb. I blinked, the figure was still there. I blinked again, it hadn't moved. I shut the curtains fast and stepped back until the back of my knees hit the couch. I turned on every light in the room, even though the brightness made the silence worse. The cabin hummed faintly, like the walls were vibrating under pressure. I tried to distract myself, but the sense of being watched grew heavier by the hour. Every window seemed to pulse with a faint presence. The cabin felt like a bubble caught in the middle of a living organism. Eventually, night came fully. The darkness outside swallowed every shape. I didn't open the curtains again. I didn't dare. But as I tried to sleep, something changed. The air shifted. The stillness outside was replaced by a slow, measured movement. Not footsteps, not knocking, something else. Breathing. Rhythmic, heavy, close to the glass. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The breathing moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and steady, like something large was circling the building. Every time it paused, my own breath hitched in my throat. When it reached the bedroom window, the sound became sharper, as though the breath was fogging the glass. I didn't look. I couldn't. Then, after a long silence, a single tap came from the window. Knuckle on glass. Soft, intentional. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for the next tap, but it never came. The breathing faded slowly, drifting into the trees until the cabin was silent again. I didn't sleep. I sat up until dawn, staring at the bedroom door, waiting for any sign of movement. When morning finally came, I opened the curtains with trembling fingers. The clearing was empty. The ground was undisturbed. The forest looked as still as a painting. But the hollow tree was closer again. Maybe only 50 feet from where it had been the day before. Its dark opening faced the cabin like an eye. Watching. I stayed inside most of the morning, packing from wall to wall with the sick feeling that the cabin had become smaller overnight. Every window felt like an exposed point where something could watch me. I kept catching glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, shadows shifting just outside the frame, but whenever I turned my head, the forest looked frozen. The hollow tree stood even closer now. I didn't measure the distance, but I didn't need to. It had moved. By noon, the air inside felt strange, heavy, damp. The smell of wet earth drifted through the room even though the floor was dry. It reminded me of the hollow tree and the cold air inside it. I tried opening a window for fresh air, but the second I unlatched it, a sharp sound came from the woods. Not an animal, not a branch, something like a brief exhale. Quick, intentional. I shut the window fast and locked it again. Later in the afternoon, I tried calling the ranger station from the landline near the kitchen. The number posted above the phone connected me to a recorded message that cut out halfway through. Static filled the line. Then a faint voice I couldn't understand. I hung up before it got clearer. Around dusk, when the light dimmed and the forest began to blend with the color of the sky, I saw movement for real. Not a trick of shadow, not a guess. Something stepped out from behind a pine near the tree line. For a moment I swore it was just a person, a ranger maybe, someone checking on the cabin. The shape had the outline of a human, tall and thin, arms hanging at its sides. It didn't walk out fully. It only leaned from behind the tree as if studying the cabin, studying me. I raised my hand a little, unsure if I should wave or hide. The figure didn't move. It stayed half-concealed, head tilted ever so slightly. I stared at it for several minutes until my eyes watered. A cold shiver crawled down my spine when I realized something was wrong with the posture. A person leaning would shift weight, show breath, adjust balance. This figure didn't. It stayed fixed in place like a drawing pin to a wall. I stepped back from the window. The figure disappeared behind the tree the moment I moved. Night fell quickly after that. The darkness outside thickened until the forest vanished into a single black mass. I kept the lantern lit and every lock secured. For a while, nothing happened. The silence grew dense and stretched thin, waiting for something to break it. It came just after midnight. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, spaced apart like whoever walked had long legs. The boards creaked under each step, then stopped. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't move, I listened. The first knock came from the wall, near the living room window. A single flat thud. Not on the door, on the wall itself, as if a hand the size of a plate had pressed hard into the wood. Then another knock, this time at the opposite side of the cabin. Then another behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip. The knocks moved from wall to wall, slow and deliberate, like something was circling the cabin and testing the boundaries. I shouted through the walls without meaning to, telling whoever it was to stop. The knocking paused. For a full minute, there was only the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then something stepped up to the window. The lantern flickered as a shadow passed across the glass. A tall shape, thin, wrong. I forced myself to look. The silhouette stood so close that the glass fogged in the shape of a mouth. But the breath was too slow, too cold, spreading across the window like frost forming from the inside out. I backed away toward the bedroom. The floor creaked under my steps, and the shadow moved with me, sliding along the glass as though tracking me from the other side. Then came the smell. Wet earth, pine, and something sour like rotting wood. It filled the room before I even reached the hallway. My eyes stung. My skin prickled. A pressure pushed against the air, making the walls feel tighter. The old mirror near the coat rack began to fog as though something had stood directly in front of it. I stepped closer to the mirror, drawn by a mix of fear and disbelief. That was when I saw it. A smear of mud ran across the top edge of the frame, not random. Fingers had dragged through it, leaving long streaks on the glass. 5 marks, too thin to be human. I stumbled back. My heel hit something on the floor. When I looked down, a faint trail of mud wound across the boards, leading from the back door toward the mirror. Something had been inside while I slept. I checked the back door immediately. The lock was intact. No sign of forced entry, but the smear of mud on the inside handle told a different story. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the lantern with the flashlight in my lap and waited for movement. The forest breathed against the windows through the darkness. Just before dawn, a soft tap came from the front door. Not loud, not urgent, almost gentle. I opened it with slow, shaking hands. No figure stood waiting. No footprints marked the soil. Only 3 objects sat neatly on the porch. A small locket, a pine branch tied with hair, and a bone the size of a finger, smooth and pale. The cabin felt colder behind me. The forest in front of me felt awake. The visitor hadn't left. It was getting closer. I left the objects on the porch at first. I couldn't bring myself to touch them. The locket glinted under the morning light, reflecting a pale shimmer across the boards. The bone lay perfectly straight, as though placed with intention. The branch tied with hair moved slightly in the breeze, though the air around me felt completely still. I shut the door and locked it again. The lock felt useless. For the first time since arriving, I considered leaving everything behind and running through the trees until I found a road. But the memory of the forest twisting around me the last time I tried to explore stopped me cold. The woods weren't normal. They bent space in ways I couldn't understand. The hollow tree moved. The The wind carried whispers shaped like my name. Something in the forest wanted me here. Something had chosen me. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I tried cleaning to distract myself, but the silence made every movement sound too sharp. I tried reading, but my eyes drifted toward the windows every few minutes. The sunlight never seemed to fully reach the clearing. It stayed thin and pale, as if filtered through water. By afternoon, I noticed food missing from the kitchen. Not all of it, just pieces. Half a slice of bread gone, a few crackers missing from the box, a spoon left out even though I hadn't used one. It wasn't much, but it wasn't an accident. Someone had touched my things. I walked the cabin twice, checking closets, checking the crawl space under the bed, checking the bathroom. Nothing. But the air inside felt warmer in some places and colder in others, like something had moved through it recently. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the cabin grew darker quicker than usual. I lit the lantern early. The flame cast long shadows across the floor, stretching up the walls like thin arms. I nailed the front door shut with the small toolkit I'd found under the sink. The sound of the hammer echoed like gunshots through the clearing. Every strike felt like it might draw something closer. I covered the windows with blankets, leaving only small gaps near the edges. The darkness outside felt alive. The trees blended into a single black shape. The hollow tree looked like a silhouette carved from the night itself. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched. My breath sounded too loud. My heart beat too fast. I sat upright in the bed, listening for the familiar tapping or footsteps. The first knock came just after midnight. Soft. 2 taps this time. On the wall again. Not the door. Not the window. The wall beside the bed. I froze. The lantern flickered, then steadied again. I held the blanket against my chest and listened. The knock came again, lower this time, almost like it had shifted closer to the floor. Something scraped across the outside boards, slow, heavy, the sound of weight dragging against wood. It moved from one corner to another, circling the cabin at a deliberate pace. Each scrape was patient, calm. It wasn't trying to break in. It was testing, learning. A sudden crack came from the back, like something striking the siding with a fist. Then the floor beneath me vibrated just slightly, as if something large had stepped onto the porch. I tried calling out, but my voice stuck in my throat. The silence that answered felt thick and responsive, as though the forest itself listened. The next knock didn't come from outside. It came from the crawlspace beneath the floor. 3 sharp taps, right below where I sat. My body went cold. I stood and backed away from the bed. The knocking repeated, louder this time, vibrating through the boards. Something was under me. Something big enough to move with weight, small enough to slip through the unseen spaces beneath the structure. I grabbed the flashlight and ran to the far corner, pressing myself against the wall. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had started. Minutes passed. Silence stretched until it felt like the cabin might collapse under it. Then came the final signal. Not a knock. A dull thud against the porch, followed by another, and another, like something heavy was being dropped. I inched toward the window and lifted the blanket just enough to see out. A piece of my jacket lay on the porch, torn cleanly. The jacket I had worn only hours before. I hadn't damaged it. I hadn't snagged it. Yet a section of it, pocket and sleeve, rested on the boards as if something had taken hold of me without me noticing, then returned the piece as a message. A warning. Or a claim. The forest around the cabin swayed gently, though no wind passed through it. The hollow tree stood straight and still, its dark opening fixed on me like an eye. I dropped the blanket. I backed away from the window. My legs shook so badly that I had to sit down on the floor. The lantern flickered again, throwing shadows across the ceiling that seemed to bend and crawl. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I also knew I couldn't leave. Something out there had touched me without my knowing. Something had taken a piece of my clothing like a hunter keeping a trophy. Something wanted me deeper in the forest, closer to the hollow tree. I sat in the dark until morning, gripping the flashlight until my fingers went numb, waiting for the next knock that never came. The cabin was silent. The forest waited. Something had broken that night, inside the cabin, inside the woods, inside me. I wasn't alone anymore. I waited for sunrise like it was the only thing keeping the walls upright. The light didn't bring comfort. It only revealed how unsteady everything felt. My hands shook every time I looked at the torn piece of my jacket on the porch. I tried convincing myself that an animal had taken it, but the clean edge wasn't chewed or frayed. It looked cut, clean, deliberate. By mid-morning, the forest felt restless. The branches didn't sway, but the air carried a faint tremor through the clearing, like a distant engine idling below the earth. I stayed inside, listening to the strange vibration while packing from door to window, window to door. Around noon, I heard a motor. A real one this time. A truck crawled down the gravel road and stopped near the cabin. The engine shut off, leaving a sudden, eerie silence in its place. I stepped outside slowly, staying close to the wall in case something waited beyond the porch. A ranger climbed out of the truck. Tall, older, deep lines carved into his face, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in a long time. The patch on his uniform looked faded, almost worn through. He approached the cabin without smiling. "You renting the place?" he asked. I nodded, unable to keep the tension out of my voice. I wanted to grab his arm and pull him inside for safety, but something in his expression stopped me. He wasn't relaxed. He wasn't surprised to see me. If anything, he looked tired, resigned. He asked if I'd heard anything strange. I told him parts of it: footsteps, objects on the porch, the breathing outside the windows. But the moment I mentioned the hollow tree, his posture changed. His shoulders tightened. His eyes shifted toward the forest. "That tree still standing?" he asked. I nodded again. He muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like, "They've started early this year." I asked what that meant, but he didn't answer. Instead, he walked around the cabin, scanning the ground like he was searching for something specific. His gaze lingered on the footprints in the soil, long-toed, deep, not human. He didn't react with surprise. He only frowned. When he circled back to the porch, he warned me not to touch anything the forest gave back. The way he said it made my stomach twist. Before I could press him for more, he stepped closer and looked me dead in the eyes. "Don't follow any tracks. Don't answer if you hear someone call your name. And if you see anything in the trees that looks like a person, it's not." The weight in his voice made every instinct in my body tighten. I asked him if I should leave. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the woods again. Then he said something that chilled me deeper than any sound I'd heard since arriving. "It doesn't matter if you leave now. If they've marked you, they'll come." My throat tightened. I stepped back toward the cabin door. He told me he'd check the trails and return later. Then he walked off without waiting for a response. He didn't get back in his truck. He walked past it and into the forest instead. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No sound of him returning. No radio crackle, nothing. Curiosity got the better of me. I edged toward the clearing, eyes locked on the path he had taken. I expected to see him returning any moment. Instead, I saw footprints in the soil. His boot prints, clear and deep. They led past the cabin, toward the hollow tree. I followed them partway, stopping at the edge of the deeper woods. The tracks went straight, the pattern sharp and consistent. But at a certain point, just before the ground grew darker from shadow, something changed. The prints didn't turn around. They didn't curve. They didn't stop. They just ended. Abruptly, as if the man had stepped forward and vanished into thin air. No broken twigs. No disturbed soil beyond that point. Just nothing. I backed away slowly, pulse pounding in my throat. The forest around me felt too quiet again, heavy, watching. When I returned to the cabin, the porch held something new. A single pine needle, placed dead center on the welcome mat. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the air shift around me. The forest behind the cabin rustled without wind. The hollow tree's dark opening seemed wider than before. The ranger had warned me not to follow tracks. He hadn't warned what happened when the forest followed me. The forest stayed quiet for the rest of the day, but it didn't feel empty. I could sense something moving just beyond the tree line, staying out of sight but never far. Every now and then, a flicker of shadow shifted across the clearing. Sometimes it looked like a branch swayed. Sometimes it looked like a tall shape standing still. I forced myself not to stare long enough to know which it was. By late afternoon, I stepped outside to get firewood. The porch creaked under my weight, but the sound didn't echo into the woods like normal. It stopped short, swallowed by the trees. As I bent down to pick up a log, something caught my eye near the corner of the cabin. A marking, thin, etched into the wood. A circle, with a vertical line running through the center. The carving was shallow, but the edges were fresh. Pale shavings clung to the wood like something had scratched it recently. My hands went cold. I crouched to inspect it closer. The lines were too smooth to be random damage, too precise to be made by an animal. I started walking around the cabin, slow and cautious. More markings appeared on the back wall. Smaller circles, intersecting lines, patterns I didn't recognize, repeating with strange symmetry. Sheer panic crawled up my throat as I realized they weren't random. They were increasing in number. Carvings arranged around windows, under the eaves, near the crawlspace. Some were so faint I almost missed them, but once I knew to look, I found dozens, maybe more. Every single one faced the forest. Not the road. Not the lake. The forest. I scraped one with my fingernail. A thin curl of fresh wood fell away. The mark hadn't appeared slowly over time. It had appeared last night. Something had been close enough to touch every wall. Something had circled the cabin again and again, carving these symbols while I slept. I stepped back inside, heart pounding. I closed the door and slid the deadbolt in place. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the small folding knife from the kitchen drawer. It was a useless tool in any real emergency, but holding it made me feel less helpless. As daylight faded, the cabin seemed to shrink again. The air grew thick with the same scent I smelled before, pine sap and damp earth. It seeped into the walls, into my clothes. I breathed shallowly, trying not to taste it. I spent the early evening scrubbing at some of the carvings inside, the ones near the windowsill where I hadn't noticed them before. The wood flaked easily, but by the time I wiped the dust away, new marks had appeared on the opposite wall. Not carved deep, but drawn with something dark and sticky. My stomach twisted when I realized the substance smelled like sap mixed with soil. Something was marking the inside now. Later, needing answers, I went for the flashlight and crawled toward the trapdoor hidden under the small rug near the bedroom. I hesitated before lifting it, my breath shallow and uneven. The ranger's warning echoed through my head, but I had to know. I opened the hatch. A wave of cold air poured out. The cellar wasn't a full basement, only a shallow crawl space, but the beam of the flashlight revealed something that made my heart seize. More symbols, carved into the support beams, scratched into the dirt walls, painted onto the floorboards above me in dark, uneven strokes, circles crossed with long vertical lines, patterns identical to the ones outside but more numerous, many more. And at the far end, tucked into a shallow cavity between the beams, lay a small pile of objects. Offerings. Stones, feathers, bits of metal, lengths of bark, each arranged in a perfect circle around a small indentation in the earth, a hole no bigger than a fist, empty, waiting. The cold inside the crawlspace felt alive, heavy, like breath held too long. I backed out fast and slammed the hatch shut. The moment it closed, something knocked on the wall behind me. 3 times. Slow. Measured. I froze. The knocking stopped. I turned off the lantern to listen better. The darkness pressed close around me. For a minute, all I heard was my pulse thudding in my ears. Then came a new sound. A faint scratching at the front door. Not claws. Not branches. Fingers. Tracing lines across the wood. The same patterns I had seen carved into the outside walls. I grabbed the lantern again and held it close. Its glow pushed the shadows back into the corners but did nothing to calm the tremor in my chest. The scratching continued, slow and patient, like it was writing something long. Suddenly, everything went silent. The air thickened. The wood of the cabin creaked under weight that wasn't mine. The soft whisper of movement drifted along the windows. A shadow passed across the kitchen wall. Another slid near the bedroom door. I felt watched from every direction at once. When the silence finally broke, it came in the form of a low groan from the forest. Not an animal. Not wind. A long, slow breath. Then another. Then another. Like something vast was waking up. I backed into the center of the cabin, gripping the flashlight and knife. My whole body trembled. Something outside dragged a long branch across the porch, as if drawing a line. A line I wasn't meant to cross. Or a line something else was about to cross. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in the dim light. The cabin wasn't protection anymore. It was being marked. And whatever was marking it wasn't done. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment the sky above the clearing was pale and empty. The next it darkened as if something had drawn a curtain across it. The first gust of wind hit the cabin with enough force to shake the frame. The trees bent and groaned, their tops swaying in tight circles as though responding to some unseen command. I shut the windows fast, feeling cold air push against my hands as I latched them. The cabin dimmed under the sudden dusk. Thunder cracked so close that the glass rattled. It should have felt like relief. A storm meant normal weather. Normal was safe. But the rain sounded wrong. It didn't start with a patter. It began with a slow, heavy drip on the roof, one drop at a time, spaced evenly apart as though measured. Tap, tap, tap. Each one echoed through the cabin. I stood under the center beam and listened as the sound grew thicker, heavier, as if the rain was too dense for air. The lantern flickered in the humidity. The smell changed. Damp earth seeped in through every crack. I checked the windows again, making sure they were locked. The rain strengthened, but the rhythm remained unnatural, too slow, too even. I grabbed a bucket from under the sink when I heard water dripping somewhere near the bedroom. I followed the sound to the ceiling where a thin, dark streak ran down the wood. The stain spread wider the longer I looked at it. Something about the color bothered me. Rainwater wasn't supposed to look that dark. I placed the bucket beneath it and waited for the next drop. When it fell, I realized it didn't sound like water. The drop hit the bottom of the bucket with a soft, thick thud like something viscous. I leaned over it, heart pounding. The liquid at the bottom wasn't clear. It was dark and slightly sticky, with a faint smell that reminded me of pine sap mixed with something sour. Another drop fell. Then another. Slow, measured, too heavy. I backed away from the bucket. Thunder rolled overhead again, long and drawn out. The sound didn't fade the way thunder should. It resonated, lingering in the cabin like a low moan. The walls vibrated. The lantern flickered harder. The scratching began a few minutes later. Not on the door. Not on the windows. On the roof. Light at first, like fingertips dragging across the shingles, then heavier, like something walking from one end to the other, each step deliberate, each one sending tiny particles of dust drifting down from the ceiling. I stared upward, unable to breathe. Another step. Then another. Something was above me. The scratching moved toward the far side of the cabin, then stopped. The silence that followed felt worse than the sound. I crept into the living room and listened, flashlight shaking in my hand. The storm outside raged violently now, wind slamming against the siding, branches cracking in the distance. But the sound of whatever had been on the roof didn't return. Instead, something slid down the outer wall. A long, dragging scrape. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the rug. The scrape moved down the wall slow as a breath, stopping just above the foundation. Then a second scrape followed, deeper this time, carving through the wood. I held my breath. Another scrape. Another. It circled the cabin like something dragging its nails along the perimeter. I followed the sound with my flashlight beam across each wall as it traveled. The storm grew louder, trying to drown it out, but the scraping cut through the noise. When the sound finally stopped, it stopped directly beneath the bedroom window. A single knock followed. Soft. Almost curious. I pointed the flashlight at the window. The beam reflected off the wet glass, casting shaky light across the room. For a second, the reflection seemed doubled, like another image of the room was layered faintly over mine, slightly delayed. The knock came again. A little firmer. Something outside was waiting. I didn't get closer. I didn't move at all. Lightning flashed, illuminating the clearing beyond the porch in a blinding white burst. For a fraction of a second, I saw something tall standing near the tree line. Not moving. Not bothered by the storm. Still as stone. The thunder struck immediately after, loud enough to rattle the dishes in the cabinets. When the lightning came again minutes later, the figure was gone. But the scraping sound returned. Inside the walls. A faint drag from within the wood, moving slowly around the interior like something testing the strength of the structure. The rain dripped steadily through the ceiling, collecting in the bucket in dark, thick drops. The smell grew stronger. The walls shuddered under the weight of the storm. The scratching pulsed through the cabin with each gust of wind. Hours passed like that. I didn't move. I didn't blink. When the storm finally eased near dawn, the sound faded with it. The scraping stopped. The dripping slowed. The wind slipped into silence again. I stepped outside just after sunrise. The clearing was soaked. The trees glistened with rain. But nothing in the world looked washed clean. Every marking on the cabin's outer walls had deepened. Every symbol had darkened. And near the porch, carved into the wet wood, was a single new mark larger than the rest. A circle with a long vertical line through the center, drawn deep enough to expose fresh wood beneath, as if something had spent the entire night waiting for me to see it. The storm left the forest soaked and silent. Water pooled in every dip of the clearing, reflecting thin bands of pale morning light. Steam rose from the ground in slow, swirling columns that made the air feel thick. The hollow tree stood motionless near the edge of the woods, its opening darker than anything around it. After last night's marks and scraping, the silence felt heavier than the storm itself. I stayed inside most of the morning, checking every door and window again. The dark liquid in the bucket hadn't dried. It clung to the bottom in a thick smear, sticky and cold when I tried wiping it out. The smell lingered in the air, mixed with the faint tang of wet pine from the storm. By midday, the forest began to shift, not with sound, with pressure. A faint hum ran beneath the soil, the kind of vibration that travels up through the floorboards and into your bones. I could feel it beneath my feet as I walked across the cabin, like a slow pulse rising out of the earth. I stepped outside to look toward the hollow tree again. The air was unnaturally still. Not a leaf moved on the branches. Not a single bird flew overhead. I stared at the tree for a long time. Something about it felt changed. Its bark seemed darker, its shape sharper, as if the outline of it had hardened overnight. The wind picked up suddenly, not from the sky, from the hollow. A soft current of cold air drifted toward me in a thin line, as if the tree itself was exhaling. I stepped back instinctively. The cold carried a faint whisper with it, not a word I could understand, but a tone shaped like intention. As the whisper faded, I noticed something on the porch. An object waited by the door. Not multiple, just one. A photograph. I froze where I stood. The picture was curled slightly from the damp morning air. I picked it up with trembling hands. My own face stared back at me. It was a photo from my wallet, one I'd taken years ago. The problem was simple. I hadn't taken my wallet out since the day I arrived. It had been locked in a drawer inside the cabin. I checked the drawer immediately. It was open. The wallet lay inside, untouched, except for the missing photograph. I shut the drawer fast, pulse hammering in my throat. When I stepped back outside, sunlight hit the photo again and something new caught my eye. A shape. Faint. Behind me in the picture. Tall. Narrow. Tilted like a shadow standing too close. The photo had never shown that before. I knew every detail of that picture. The background had been empty, but now something stood in the space behind me, its features blurred and stretched like it didn't belong in the frame. A chill ran up my spine. I dropped the photo and the wind caught it, flipping it across the porch until it stopped near the first step. I didn't pick it up again. As the afternoon faded, the hum beneath the soil strengthened. The sound deepened into a resonance that reminded me of something alive. I heard the trees creak without wind, bending just slightly, leaning toward the clearing as though pulled by an unseen force. The sun dipped behind the ridgeline earlier than it should have. Shadows stretched quickly and sharply. The clearing dimmed, and the hollow tree's opening seemed to widen with the dark, swallowing every bit of light that reached it. Then the whisper returned. Not from the forest this time. From the hollow. A soft voice, shaped almost like language, rose from the dark space at its center. It carried through the clearing in the same pulsing rhythm as the hum beneath the ground. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning cut through me. It wanted something. It was asking. I backed toward the cabin, heart thudding. I didn't turn my back to the forest until I reached the door. Inside, the air felt dense and cold. I lit the lantern with shaking hands, watching the flame flicker like it was fighting to stay alive. But the whisper didn't stop. It slipped through the walls in thin waves, soft and steady. It asked again. I covered my ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't only in the air. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in me. I walked to the mirror near the kitchen, thinking maybe I was imagining things. The reflective surface was dark, almost too dark for the lantern's light to reach. For a moment, I saw my reflection clearly. Then the glass flickered. Something moved behind my reflection in a slow, deliberate motion. A faint shape, tall and narrow, sliding through the dark behind me. I spun around fast. Nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, it didn't show my face anymore. It showed the hollow tree. A perfect image of it, framed in the glass as though I stood in front of it instead of the cabin wall. The tree's dark opening pulsed slowly, matching the hum under the floor. The whisper grew louder. I backed away from the mirror, knocking over the lantern. The flame surged, sending shadows racing across the walls. The whisper faded abruptly. The mirror went blank again. The hum fell quiet. Silence filled the cabin, as thick as fog. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for the whisper to return, but it didn't. The forest stayed still. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. But shortly before dawn, as I dozed in the armchair, a soft knock came from the porch. I opened the door with shaking hands. The photograph had been returned to the step, and beneath it lay a small pile of dirt, shaped into a tiny mound like a grave. The forest wasn't asking anymore. It was reminding me. Something was waiting inside the hollow tree, and it wanted me to answer. I didn't touch the photograph or the mound of dirt on the porch. I shut the door gently, as if any sudden movement might draw the forest closer. The air inside the cabin was heavy again, still, watching. I kept the lantern burning even though daylight seeped through the curtains. Every corner felt deeper than it should have been, and every shadow seemed to carry weight. I avoided the mirror for most of the morning. I couldn't stop thinking about the image I'd seen the night before. The hollow tree reflected where my face should have been. But avoiding it didn't help. The pressure in the room kept building. The sense that something was waiting for me to look again. By early afternoon, the air felt cold enough for my breath to show. The frost on the inside of the windows crept inward like slow fingers. The hum beneath the floor began again, faint at first, then stronger, vibrating through the boards. It reminded me of a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I walked toward the mirror without meaning to, as if the floor pushed me forward. The moment I stood in front of it, the lantern dimmed. My reflection stared back, pale and exhausted, but something was wrong. My reflection's chest rose a second after mine. Its eyes blinked slower. Its shoulders sagged under a weight I couldn't feel. It wasn't copying me. It was following me like it was learning how to move. I raised my hand. The reflection raised it a moment late. Then slowly, its expression changed. A faint smile formed on its face. I wasn't smiling. I stepped back. The reflection didn't. It stayed close to the glass, leaning forward until its forehead almost touched the surface. The smile widened, too wide. The skin stretched like it wasn't made to move that way. The hum beneath the floor deepened. The boards shook. From outside, the trees creaked in unison, their trunks bending toward the cabin. I felt the pressure of the forest closing in. The hollow tree's cold breath seeped through the walls. The reflection lifted its hand and pressed its palm against the inside of the glass. Long fingers. Too long. Thinner than mine. A crack formed beneath the reflection's palm, a single line spreading downward like a vein, then another, and another. The cracks branched out, forming the same circle and line symbol carved around the cabin. I stumbled back and grabbed the lantern, ready to smash the mirror. Before I could swing it, something shifted behind the cracks, a dark shape moving forward through the glass like rising smoke. A whisper filled the room. Not from outside. From the mirror. The same whisper that came from the hollow tree. As the dark shape pressed closer, the glass finally split, spiderwebbing across the frame. A thin line of cold air drifted out. The lantern flickered hard. The hum beneath the cabin stopped. The forest fell completely silent. I backed toward the door, gripping the lantern until my hand cramped. The cracks widened. The shape leaned closer. The whisper grew into a single word. Mine. I ran. Out the door. Into the clearing. Away from the cabin, as the mirror shattered behind me. I didn't look back. And the forest followed,